this session. We were supposed to have 3 papers presented, but unfortunately one had to cancel. So what I've decided to do is the 2 remaining presenters, I'll give them a little more extra time. I mean, they can share the 4 minutes allocated for the 3rd presenter. So and it wouldn't damage the time we have. We would still have about half an hour for discussion afterwards. So I think that would work well. And then the theme of this part is, innovation in the role of the teacher. And we have, the papers are a little different, but I think it will be a very interesting discussion. And the way we do it is that, we have a chat function here in Zoom. So whenever you have a comment or a thought or a question or something during the presentations, just add it, type it there, and then I'll do my best to make sure that everybody who has a question, they will have a chance to ask that question or raise a comment or something. And what we'll do is we'll first have one presenter and then the next, and then all the questions and discussion. And then please all, if you could mute, I think you have muted your phone, your connection, but please mute it, because otherwise, I mean, you know why. But also, if you don't mind, put on your video, because it's always nice to see people's faces. And unless you're eating or something, you prefer not to. So, without further ado, I'll present the first presenter. That's Philip Duga from the University of Delaware in the United States. Welcome, Philip. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right. So can everybody see that okay? Everything's showing up?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Excellent. So this is a brief overview of my paper that was published in the proceedings called Backwards Design, Standards-Based Grading and Scaffolding in the PBL Classroom. So the origin for sort of how I approach this talk is how to marry the ideas of backwards design. Those of you who are familiar with Wiggins and McTighe's work in Understanding by Design, basically what they do is they describe a backwards process where you begin with goals, then you go back to assessments, and then you finally end up with activities. When you compare that approach to sort of top-down approach to the way many instructors develop PBL problems, which is much more bottom-up, they think about hooks. What are activities? What are ways that I can engage my students? So really what I tried to do this talk is think about ways where we can kind of negotiate those 2 approaches and some helpful tools that I found in doing that. So those 2 helpful tools are standards-based grading, which is a method of record keeping that is organized according to objectives as opposed to grades, and also scaffolding, which many of you are familiar with. It's an idea of like providing students support and ways of manipulating your problems to give those students that support. So I wanted to give a brief overview of what standards-based grading is. So as I mentioned, it's organized around learning objectives as opposed to grades. So it explicitly aligns course outcomes with assessments. Those of you who've used rubrics before, you'll find a lot of similarities, with the notable difference that in standards-based grading, those rubric grades do not sum to a total. Each outcome is sort of maintained separately. And what that allows you to do is actually get quite a bit of more information, both to the students and for the instructors. So I'll give you a brief snapshot of what it might look like for a student's gradebook. So notice that here we have a student gradebook that you could see. You have the assignment organized as different rows, and each assignment might address any number of different standards in a course. And what this method of record keeping does is it organizes each grade by standard. So in this example, these are 1 through 4 scores. So this on assignment 2, for the first standard, the student got a 2. For the second standard, they got a 3. And they did not get any grades for standards 3 and 4. Similarly, on assignment 1, there was a grade for standard 1 and 3 and 4, but not standard 2. So each assessment or each sort of outcome can have a different sort of correlation in terms of how they're showing up in a grade book. And what this allows an instructor to do is be very explicit about what each assignment is meant to address, excuse me, and how the student performed in relation to each assignment. On the instructor level, if you sort of go back to the higher level of the whole class, here what I've done is this average page. the way this shows these course averages, that's then showing up here. And you can go by assignment in each of the tabs below. And what this spreadsheet essentially does is correlate all that information for an instructor, allows them to see sort of which standards a student is doing better or worse on, allows to see like how a student is doing overall in the course. So it gives a lot of rich information for an instructor that is broken down not only by assignment, but also by course outcome. And that method of organization, I think, is really helpful, especially in a case of PBL. One of the things that switching to a standards-based grading workbook allowed me to do is really just also to specify and communicate to the students the importance of what I like to call like the non-content outcomes that are often associated with PBL. For example, often in PBL, you have students creating models for complex problems. You have them gather and evaluate information, develop solutions, use effective communication methods, and of course, work well with others. So having those things as specific outcomes in your course and communicating that to students just provides that level of transparency about why you're adopting PBL, and also shows them that that they will be evaluated on these skills in addition to the content level knowledge that is so typically done in courses. So summarize like why we would use standards-based grading. So to specify the learning goals of a problem, including those non-content goals, what a colleague of mine calls power skills. And I think that's such an apt term for what we really want to develop in our students, this idea of critical thinking and communication, teamwork, all these things that are such a big part of doing problem-based learning. It communicates clearly with the students. After the activity is completed, standards-based grading can actually make your job as an instructor easier by making grading easier. And I'm happy to return to that idea if people have questions in the question and answer period. It also allows you to discriminate performance according to each learning goal, as opposed to giving a summative sort of score to an assignment where sort of strengths and weaknesses are masked. You get each learning goal gets its own grade, and it allows students to focus their attention on specific outcomes that they might need to address. So in a normal course, if you gave like 2 students an 80%, one student might have a fundamental misconception of sort of how to model a problem, but another student just might have calculation errors. Well, those are very different things. And in a sort of 1 through 100 scale, those students might get the same score. Using standards-based grading, you can actually specify like the score that they would get for modeling would be low, and then for the other student, the score for calculations would be low. So it actually, those grades are much more informative in terms of what that student needs to work on. Once you've identified sort of standards, taken a standards-based grading approach and identified sort of your goals and things for each problem, what that allows you to do is then sort of turn to scaffolding to make sure that your problem are meeting those educational goals. So for example, you will focus on the learning goals for a given problem, but also exclude those skills that are not germane to that problem. Scaffolding for me becomes this ability to construct problems in a way that maximizes their efficiency. I often think about manipulating what I consider to be the efficiency effectiveness axis. So we know that having students spend a lot of time in these PBL activities is a very rich, rewarding activity, and that time is well spent. But oftentimes we don't have a luxurious, 3 weeks to give to a problem. So sometimes we have to make these compromises to make problems more efficient, and using scaffolding in this very directed way is to say, these are my primary learning goals, these are my primary outcomes that I'm going to focus on, and I'm actually going to give them this data set ahead of time because I don't need them to collect data here, or I don't need them to sort of construct like go into the field to collect data or any sort of part of the problem. You could say like you have a statistician working with you, and once they give you data, you'll crunch it for them and send it back. So you can sort of build into a problem all these different things to make sure that you're focusing on just the learning goals that are important to your problem and not those that that you can exclude for that problem. Ideally, the end result is hopefully that you're creating PBL activities that are in line with the goals and the time available. And that's often an important consideration for instructors. Really, it's that synergy between goals and activities. So often when I'm working with or developing PBL problems, I want to ask what version of a problem will be most effective within the given time frame, and what modifications will balance learning goals with time available and student engagement. And that's kind of the focus of what my paper is. So thank you so much. If you're interested in the scripts, for some reason they didn't come through the link in the article that was published, you can go to this website, and this is all on GitHub, so you can download it there. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you very much, Philip. And it was very interesting. And so as I said in the beginning, we will have both presentations and then we'll have the discussion. And yeah, let's applaud. And just to remind you, if you have comments or questions, just add them in the chat. I've already added one, but just feel free to add comments or questions. So, but then our next presenter is Ginny Servang-Miklas from Erasmus University Rotterdam. So you're welcome, Ginny.
Let me unmute myself, that's going to help. Yeah, actually, this presentation is something a little bit different. I would say it fits within a broader discussion of what we want to do with PBL, what we want to get out of PBL, and how PBL can help us to reshape the very conceptions that we have of education. I am at Erasmus University, and I'm known at Erasmus University as an advocate of critical pedagogy. So I do also a lot of public intellectual work around the sort of education conference or these kind of debate houses that we have around here, or we had before coronavirus, about critical pedagogy. So what I want to talk to you about actually is an experiment that I've been running with my colleague Irene van Oorschot, with a class of liberal arts students at a liberal arts colleges that we run here. It's a part of Erasmus University, but it's like its own college within Erasmus University. And that is in sustainability education. The thing we wanted to focus on, it kind of fits in with what was being said just before about how the assessment actually, we start with the assessment and then we build from there. So we thought we need to reinvent the assessment completely first before we think about the rest of the course, because if we want to make a radically different course, the course is called The Climate Crisis, but if we want to make a radically different course in using PBL, but then we throw in an exam and we throw in kind of a standard kind of essay at the end, then we're just simply going to repeat the patterns of thought and repeat the patterns of behavior that we see in all the other courses. And these students are especially driven by high BSAs, high grades. They're very high achievers. So we wanted to kind of break away from that kind of thinking. And so we focused on the skills that we wanted to impart. We wanted them to develop these skills to be able to conceptualize and live with the climate crisis in the decade that comes, in the decades that come, and be active and hopeful participants in the solutions to the climate crisis. When I say PBL, I mean problem-based learning in the sense that we know in the Netherlands. So I mean problem-based learning in the Erasmus University College uses the model from Maastricht. So the 7-step model of PBL. And it's an 8-week course, bachelor level, but we have a lot of first years. So even it's 200 level, but we have a lot of first years, usually between 60 and 90 students. The course has actually just started this week for 2021. It's a very interdisciplinary course. We use the Maastricht model of problem-based learning, and I've put one of the problems is problem 4 that you can see here on the picture. And they have there's a little bit more text that comes with the problem, but it's just the names of the scenarios. So social capitalism, degrowth and post-capitalism and collapse. And then the students basically have an hour and a half to discuss this following the 7-step method. And so they have 6 such problems during the course. And the course, what makes this course different is that the whole epistemological framework that we built the course around comes from critical theory, ecofeminism, and indigenous approaches. So it's a decolonial course. It's an active exercise in decolonizing education. From the start to the finish, we discuss indigenous approaches. I don't know if you can see, but we use this book a lot. It's written, as we have always done, by Leanne Simpson, who is a Canadian First Nations author. We use a lot of Black authors. We use a lot of feminist authors, so Donna Haraway, We use Ursula Le Guin, we use Anna Tsing, we use Laura Pulido on Black ecologies. So we really challenge this kind of techno-fix, capitalism will solve it kind of narrative on sustainability, which is a narrative that I see a lot in more technical forms of education, engineering education, STEM education. There's a predominance of this technology will fix it narrative, and we really draw students away from that. We draw students into imagining a more conscious way of engaging with nature, but also seeing themselves as part of nature, relating to nature in different ways, borrowing again from indigenous thought on kinship. The course is interdisciplinary. So in week 1, the lecture I've just had was on climate science and the Anthropocene. So we throw the facts at them about climate change. Usually this is the week where they get very depressed. Then next week, we're going to be doing the historicizing of the climate crisis. And this is where we tell alternative stories. So we talk about the Anthropocene, and then we criticize this notion with the Capitalocene. So Jason Moore's work on relating climate change to capitalism. Plantationocene, which is a decolonial perspective on climate change, and particularly talks about slavery and the slave trade as kind of the initiation point of climate change and environmental collapse. In week 3, we talk about political economy and particularly fossil fuel lobbying against climate action. So students have to look through the Exxon Secrets website. And we have a guest speaker who is works on the team of Naomi Oreskes on corporate malfeasance. And then week 4, we have Jan Rotmans as the guest lecturer. He's the foremost transition specialist in the Netherlands. He's the one who initiated the lawsuit against the state for failing in their climate obligations. And we talk about transition scenarios, social capitalism, post-capitalism collapse. In week 5, I am going to actually very excited this year because Renee Lertzman, one of the foremost climate psychologists in the world, has agreed to come and give the lecture with me. The benefits of the pandemic is now she's in California, I'm here, and we're going to have the lecture together. So that's one thing that we hadn't imagined last year, which we imagined for this year. And finally, week 6 and 7, we're talking about reimagining the future in a life with warming. So we're not going to Tesla our way out of this. So how can we learn to live with warming? And here we use Afrofuturism, world building, imagination. So radical imagination, radical decolonial, post-capitalist imagination to help the students. So how we assess this? Collaboration through group projects inspired by my experience at Aalborg University. It's a somewhat shorter project, somewhat close to what you guys call P0. So it's a short project. They have to develop a podcast in groups on climate change in the Netherlands. They have a reflection piece where they have to use an approach to climate psychology. So it could be psychoanalysis, it could be cognitive behavioral aspects like cognitive dissonance, it could be identity theory, it could be my personal favorite, existential phenomenology. And then they have to reflect on their own journey through processing climate change, and students really appreciated this particular aspect. And then imagination through this world building essay. So they have to imagine themselves in a relationship with someone else who is from a poorer background than they are, or an object like a turtle or another being, basically another living being, through time all the way up till 2100. So really try to engage, because I found in my research that students were incapable of engaging with their own future. So we're really trying to force them, like, you are not going to escape this, so you have to start imagining your future now. The results, students loved the course on the whole. The assignment they liked the best was the reflection assignment. They really felt that they got something very personal out of it. The group project, the non-Dutch students felt that they were losing out a bit because they couldn't conduct the interviews themselves for the podcast with Dutch-speaking scientists, etc. That's always going to be a problem when you're trying to instigate local education with an international student population. Students did wonder if psychology isn't by nature individualizing, so they felt there might be a conflict between the psychological approach on the one hand and the collectivist indigenous approach on the other hand. And we changed the imagination assignment slightly because it was like a Marmite assignment. Students either loved it or hate it. Most students absolutely loved it because the mode on here was 7 out of 7 on the Likert scale. But there were a few students who were like, I absolutely hate this kind of assignment. So we've changed it a little bit this year to be more relational, because we noted a problem where students, even if they engaged with a kind of future self in 2100, they still were stuck in this kind of privileged lifestyle, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to fly around the world anymore. And we were saying to them, maybe that's the least of the problems we're going to have in 2100. So we try to get them to engage more with a collective responsibility and a sense of the responsibility that comes with privilege. So that's basically our course.
Thank you very much to both authors. It was really interesting, and let's give also Jeannie a round of applause. And we were thinking, when maybe the papers are different, but I saw some commonalities. I mean, this focus on assessment. What is assessment actually, and the role assessment has in whenever you want to apply, implement some new teaching, or if you are in any kind of teaching, the role of assessment is really big and essential, and which also you, Philip, talked about, this backwards planning. And it actually made me think, now there aren't any questions except my own in the chat, so please add some questions, but maybe I should be the one asking the first question. It's maybe for both of you. How do you see the role of assessment in changing, both in planning, and how do you do it in practice, but also, I mean, how, if you can come up with some examples, but also how important is assessment overall in when you do whatever teaching you're implementing. I don't know who wants, maybe Philip.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. Yeah, assessment is crucial. I mean, it really, I think a lot of things that most teachers do is they just kind of assess the way they were assessed, or assess the way that's commonly done in those disciplines. And it's really easy to sort of follow those same pathways because they're tried and true for how many years, regardless of how effective they actually are. I think in some ways it's really nice to rethink those ideas, and one of the things that I know Jeannie mentioned this as well, just getting students to reflect on what they've done is such an important thing. There's a lot of work that's been done on sort of metacognitive strategies and developing metacognitive strategies in students to get them to become reflective learners, and how that can contribute to sort of the way they pursue their own sort of interests and concerns. And getting students to sort of incorporate that component, I think, is crucial, especially in a PBL context where so much of the attention is on doing the activity, that it's so important to then, once the activity is finished, to then reflect back and get students to say, all right, what did we do? What were we hoping to learn by doing those things? And really getting them to think carefully about the goals and how they met with those activities. That helps them not only transfer to different domains, but just sort of solidify that learning that took place within the process.
Thank you.
For me as a critical pedagogue, it's always very difficult, the question of assessment, because, you know, if you read Paulo Freire, traditional forms of assessment are more associated with what he called banking education. So this more kind of traditional top-down transfer of knowledge. And as a critical pedagogue, it's difficult to, like, I don't aspire to this kind of standardized form of learning. That's not what education is for, in my view. At the same time, contra to Paulo Freire, the students I'm working with are actually the most privileged on the planet. And so I have the opposite problem of Paulo Freire. I'm not trying to make them aware of their oppression. I'm trying to make them aware of the fact they, by and large, have the oppressor role in this system, particularly when it comes to environmental footprint. And so that's a very difficult message to get across. There's a lot of resistance on part of students. They feel like their identity is being personally attacked when you talk about their environmental footprint, when you talk about the impact that their actions unwillingly or unwittingly have, because they all want to be seen as good people. And when you talk about, you know, your actions have an impact, you know, you buy that shirt from that shop and you know that someone has made it for very little money. in Bangladesh, or even slave labor in Uyghur camps these days. And that's a very, it conflicts with their identity as good people. So one of the advantages of assessment is you have to engage with this now. We want you to engage with this, you have to engage with this. And we have to be very careful as teachers, Irene, Sophie, and I, who are working on this course, to not judge the process that they go through. So we're not saying you have to think this, or you have to go through this process in this way. What we're looking at is more that they are going through a process systematically of reflection. It's like, are you able to take a step back from your own thoughts and feelings and analyze this in a more critical and a more academic way, in a way? So that's what we're looking at. I don't judge students for saying, you know, I'm in denial about climate change. We don't judge that. Like, when we're, as critical pedagogues, we are always vulnerable to the accusation that we're trying to indoctrinate students, or that we're trying to force certain social outcomes through. So there's always this dialectic tension between the personal freedoms of students and urgent societal problems like climate crisis. We've got 10 years to fix this, basically. So that's a challenge. That's why we used assessment. That's why we had these assessment moments, to say, right, now is the time that you have to engage with this. And you have to, because you are part of this. You're part of the problem, basically. You're part of the problem of climate change. So we have no choice but to make you engage with this.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about, when we talk about assessment, Philip, you mentioned the terms formative and summative assessment a bit, and I was thinking, when you talk about assessment in general, it's useful to distinguish between those concepts, where summative is more at the end of a course or project, that, so to what extent have you fulfilled the learning objectives? But formative assessment, that's assessment going on during the course or the project or the whole process. And I was thinking, when I saw your spreadsheets, Philip, that it looked a bit like that could be used for formative assessment. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong. And also, Ginny, I mean, I appreciate your thoughts, but I was just thinking also, how is it sound like you're more talking about the summative assessment when you talked about assessment, but do you have some formative assessment in that they go, you support, or I don't know?
So a lot of instructors who adopt standards-based grading allow for makeup grades or revisions and things like that. So you could use it either way. Like, the system isn't inherently formative or summative. It's just, again, like a method of recording information. So it could be used in either system. Personally, I'm a huge fan of formative assessment. I think that's essential for students to sort of know that they're on the right path, and to have reassurances from the instructor that we sort of, you know, are supportive of the directions they're taking things, especially if you have a PBL problem that can get sort of a diversity of responses. Like, if a group is going in a direction where they're focused on one discipline and another group is on a completely different field, I think it's really helpful for students to get that acknowledgement that, yes, this is a valid pathway to complete the assignment. And so I think the formative assessment, even if done sort of just informally, walking around the room in a class, or walking around Zoom rooms or whatever we do these days, is essential and really helpful for students. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just seeing questions in the chat as well that I'm getting. Formative assessment we use as well. So the students have a diary, a reflection diary that they may use. We're not forcing them to use it. We just say, you might find this helpful in preparation for your summative assessment. Same for the participation in the PBL classes. But if I'm very honest, a lot of students are very intrinsically motivated in this course to participate in the classes. So it's not like we've ever had to drag students on or push them. And I am careful, because what I noticed last year is that some students, there was one student I remember who was basically completely quiet for the first 2-3 PBLs, and then she came to see me afterwards, and she just said, basically, I was in shock. I was just in so much shock at the problems are shocking. We're showing them a map of the world at +4 degrees. So a likely scenario for 2100, and for some students that's such a state of shock. So we must be careful not to make that into too much of a standardized things like participation or that kind of day-to-day reflection in the reflection diaries, because some students will need more time than others. Some students will process differently, and that's also why we don't say you have to take this or this psychological approach. Some students will prefer to be more cognitive and more based on cognitive reflection skills, and some students will prefer to reflect from more existential perspective and really deal with things like, what is the meaning of this for my life? So it's really, even though we have 67 students this year and we had 80 something last year, it feels to me like one of the most personal courses that I have, and where I really try to build these relationships with students. It's much harder this year in the pandemic, of course, because I used to leave time open after my PBL class and say, hey, you can come talk to me afterwards. I had to help this young chap that was in my class whose father was a senior executive at Shell Oil. And he just went through a complete existential crisis basically in the class, because he had to deal with the dissonance of having his father telling him, oh, Shell is going to fix climate change, while at the same time reading the documents that show that Shell has deliberately obfuscated the truth about climate change for 30 years. And so I am concerned about the mental well-being of my students in this time. Formative assessment does allow us in some sense to kind of also fulfill our social obligations as almost kind of a mentor role as teachers, which we have been forced to take on by the pandemic. So I do feel like we have to build in more of these check-in moments now that we're all on Zoom, whereas they were more natural and they were less structured last year, because we could just like, hey, I need to see you 5 minutes. Let's have a talk about this.
So Jenny, actually, I had a question. How many of what percentage would you say of your students actually complete the journals? And do you have time to give feedback to each one? I know with 70 students, that's quite a lot on your plate, probably.
Yeah, so the students, I don't ask them to give me their journal unless they want to. So if they want to, so I had 4 of my students, of course I share the work with Irene and Sophie, I'm not alone on this course, there's 3 of us. 4 of my students gave me their diaries to actually read through. I'd say half of my students took the opportunity to come and actually talk to me one-on-one and have these more reflection moments in person. And about a third of the students just didn't share anything with me until that reflection essay, until that point, like, you have to now do an essay about this. I would say the girls were more inclined to have these discussions with me beforehand, and a lot of the male students kind of kept it in until more the reflection moments. But I do know that quite a lot of male students also went through a kind of existential crisis somewhere through that course.
Thank you.
And do you? Oh, sorry.
No,
I just wanted to follow up. Do you give any feedback on the journals? Is it a completion grade? Do you write comments, like it's verbal, or how do you?
It depends on the students and on what they want to get out of it. So they'll contact me and say, hey, like for instance, there's one girl whose journal was so extraordinary that I actually asked her for her permission to write this up into a phenomenological study, because she's biracial, so she's half from a country in Africa and half from a country in Europe, and she went through this massive existential crisis of like the half of herself that was from Africa that was in conflict with the half of herself that was from Europe, and I really took it on a case-by-case basis with the students. Like, do you want to talk about this? Do you want to use this? So they could also use their diary as raw data for their reflection assignments, and some of the students chose to do that. That worked quite well. For me, what's really important for me in this course isn't the grades. I think everyone passed last year. It's really, what is the quality of the journey that you've been through? What is now your understanding of the climate crisis, your role in it, your potential for action, your agency? And that is, it's going to be hard this year to see that through the Zoom camera rather than as a one-on-one. I have to say this is definitely a challenge.
Thank you. Is there maybe someone else who wants to ask a question or have a comment? And I think we can all see each other on the screen. So if you just like, or either just raise your hand or just start talking, I think that will work very well. We're like 20, so it'll be fine on the screen. But I do have some more questions. I just thought I wouldn't kind of take the table all the time. No, it's just that's actually that's a question for you, Jeannie, because during your presentation you talked about that you were critical about the notion that technology will fix it, and I just want to ask you, don't you think technology is part of the solution?
I mean, what is technology? Technology is the use of machine power, the use of energy channeled through machine power to accomplish activities that humans or animals or whatever would do. It's the kind of it's a process for using up energy, basically. There is this mystifying discourse around technology that I think kind of misunderstands what technology is and what it does, and the scale at which technology and speed at which it's like a lot of people forget that the internet is actually built up of cables that run underneath the ocean. You know, it's not magic. It's not even waves. It's mostly just cables that run under the ocean, and that took decades to build this kind of network that runs under the ocean. And of course, that most of the internet's data, here talking on Zoom, these conversations are being saved on servers that are, you know, produce massive amounts of heat and have to be kept in very stable areas. You can't have your data housed somewhere that's prone to flooding, that's prone to bushfires, that's prone to, and there are going to be fewer and fewer of these places where we can actually safely build these technological. So we're kind of crushed by these two things that are happening at the same time. Running out of resources on the one hand, we're already past the peak of conventional oil, so we're all digging into shale and in kind of these oils that also produce significant side effects like methane. And at the same time, we're out of the Holocene. We're into a geological era that is far less stable, that is far less prone to having not only stable physical conditions for developing technology, innovation, etc., but also far less good social and political conditions. Because when governments are spending all their money in trying to keep people afloat during a pandemic, or spending all their money in trying to, I don't know if you followed what's happening here in the Netherlands, but we've had 3 nights in a row of riots. So that's not a good condition, or when half your scientific staff is busy doing childcare instead of research, then that's not the ideal conditions for developing technological solutions when we're in this state of constant global emergency. I don't believe we're ever going back to normal. The after pandemic, we're out of the Holocene, so into the pandemic. This is just part of the Anthropocene, or the new age of man. It's an age outside of the stability zone. To say technology will fix it is to aspire to go back to the Holocene, to go back to a geological era that has passed. In the next 5 years, there's a 25% chance we hit 1.5 degrees of global warming. The chance that we stay below 2 degrees of warming is close to nil. So technology cannot fix it, because it was the problem. So we need to, that's what the course, what my course tries to say is.
But I didn't mean that. I didn't ask if technology would fix it, but that it's part of the solution. Like when you develop very efficient sun cells, for example, or windmills, or other kind of renewable energy. And I mean, I don't think
that's not addressing the fundamental question. The solution to what? The solution to our profligate lifestyles, where an American consumes as much as 40 or 50 people from Uganda? Is that the solution that we're aiming for? And that's what I try to reframe in this course. It's like the normal, the way we were living the way we have been living in the past century is an absolute disaster for biodiversity. I mean, even if we fix somehow climate change with carbon extraction technology and solar panels, I mean, solar panels are made of something. You've got to extract those minerals from somewhere. And when they run out of their lifetime in 20 years or 30 years, you've got to recycle them somehow. And if we, which is the fastest way to get rid of coal, is to build nuclear power stations, you better make sure you have a stable political and social system to look after those power stations for the next 200-300 years. And so that's part of what we, Irene and I, try to reframe with works like Donna Haraway's work or Anna Tsing's work, The Mushroom at the End of the World, Life in Capitalist Ruins. That's the name of the book that we use and recommend. And also this book about indigenous living and indigenous thought. It's thinking about the solution to what in different ways. Like the solution is not to try and keep living as if we had 5 planets, just plus with solar cells or whatever.
Thank you. There's a question from Klaus. Klaus, do you want to say it? Just, I think it's easy if you just say it.
Okay, because I was wondering from both of you, Ginny and Philip, what are the implications for the teacher role, like implication based on your cases, based on your studies? I know you didn't put this heading for this session, but somehow somebody did, and there are a lot of work in what you've been doing, both of you. So please say something about implications for the teacher or educator role.
So I went first last time. Ginny, do you want to take a turn?
Sure. So as I said, it's a tricky one. We're in a very tricky, as Latour said it, Bruno Latour, the French sociologist of science and technology studies, he said, you cannot today study sustainability and be politically neutral. It's not possible because to name the problem is to take a stance on the problem. You can't look and say, hey, we're heading to 3.7 degrees of global warming and not do something about it. That's just like, the age of axiological neutrality is over, and that bleeds over, I think, into the teaching profession. You cannot be a teacher and say to the kids in front of you, hey, by the way, we're about to lose 1 million species and we're heading, to 3.7 degrees of global warming, but I'm just going to tell this, you go home and deal with this now. And I think, therefore, as teachers, we have this interesting, the sooner we accept that we have a dialectic role between student agency and freedom on the one hand, and social and collective urgency on the other hand, and that we need to be comfortable in that dialectic that empowers students to think freely, but also makes them aware of the physical, social, economic constraints, the structural world within which they live. The best way to do that, I actually think Paulo Freire is outdated on this. Paulo Freire tried to make the marriage between Sartre and Marx. I'm calling for the marriage between Bourdieu and Simone de Beauvoir as a far better way to articulate classes in practice, structures in practice, rather than as relations of modes of production, as in Bourdieu versus Marx. And Simone de Beauvoir had a more engaged position towards freedom. Your freedom is not free until you engage yourself in freeing others. That was Simone de Beauvoir's existentialism. So that's like my next move in trying to articulate the role of teaching and pedagogy. I haven't had time to put it to paper yet, but I hope I will this year.
So yeah, I think the implications of my talk are less radical, probably. I think you could adopt standards-based grading regardless of what role you would imagine taking as a teacher and what role you're more comfortable in. I think one of the things that is important if you would adopt standards-based grading, is just be sure that you're clearly communicating with students. I think similar to something Ginny described, the first time like students get a standards-based grading assignment back, they might be very confused, just like, what, all these grades, what does this mean? And it's very easy, especially students, and quoting Ferriga, who have taken to the bank, the sort of like the bank model of education. They'll just take their paper, look at it, and then stuff it in their bag. But I think talking them through like how to read their grade sheet, how to understand all the information they're being given using the system is a really important component, because it's really easy, to quote Ian Hacking, to get like sort of overwhelmed by the avalanche of numbers that we occupy in today. And one of the dangers of standards-based grading is sort of feeding into that, like you're giving students more and more information and sort of breaking it down into even more discriminated ways. So I think it's important to just talk through those things and make sure you're communicating with students. I'm also a big fan of sort of minimalist markings for grading. So often I teach music, so oftentimes if I'm correcting a paper, I'll like just put an X around the margin of where there's a problem, but not specifically point out the error, like, with extensive notes and things like that, because I want the students to have a chance to diagnose their own problems. And what that does is say there's a problem around here, the student can then look at the work and try to figure it out, but also making it clear that that's what you're doing. Like, you don't want students to necessarily get their paper back and be like, well, something's wrong here, but I don't know what it is. So you have to talk them through the process, like take the time to try to figure it out. And if you still can't figure it out, then you come talk to me and I can help you with that. So I think, yeah, those are some of the implications for the rules. But I would say that switching to using scaffolding is something that many teachers use, but switching to a standards-based grading, which is probably less common, can be adapted to most teaching situations and most situations that instructors would find themselves most comfortable.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? It doesn't seem to be, but I think we've had a really interesting talk, both the talks both from Philip and Jeannie. And someone was just saying they were really inspiring and although different, and thanks to both of you, and that's from Isabella. And I'm just wanted to second that. It has been really interesting, and thank you for your very good answers and your very interesting presentations. And I look forward to reading more about the work you're doing. And also thank you for all the participants. And I hope we're going to have more Flip PBL sessions, and I hope that you'll be able to attend those as well. And so just as a final remark is that I hope you'll all stay safe and your family will be safe, and let's give them a round of applause.
I will say that I'm always looking for people who are interested in developing these concepts of critical pedagogy in sustainability education. So if that's you, if you have an interest in developing critical pedagogy for climate crisis and sustainability education, do get in contact with me. See if we can work something together.
And thank you so much to Bettina for being our moderator and Jube for handling the technology. Thank you both for making a very smooth session. Good,
thank you. So, well, let's say bye for now and hope to see you again at the next Flip PBL room or at the conference. We are going to have hopefully a conference physically at some point, but yeah, fingers crossed. Okay, bye.
Bye, and thank you.
Thank you. Hyggeligt at se dig, Mona. Og nu forsvandt hun.